What if I told you there was a period when life moved at a gentler pace yet somehow felt sharper? An era where even the smallest things, from a melody on the radio to the scent of toast in the morning, seemed to carry extra weight. The 1980s in Britain were far from flawless, but they carried an unpolished charm that no longer exists. Streets were filled with actual voices instead of buzzing alerts. Families shared a single television, one telephone, and a kettle, and somehow that was sufficient. It was a decade of contrasts, resilience, and constant change. Britain stood suspended between tradition and transformation, weaving its identity through music, style, politics, and daily routines. This isn't merely nostalgia. It is a return to a world that shaped us. So come along and relive what it genuinely meant to experience life in 1980s Britain. If this content speaks to you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. Without further ado, let's continue. In working-class homes, you would often see lace curtains, coal fires, and wallpaper unchanged since the 60s. The air carried the smell of toast and boiled cabbage, and dinners were always filling. Gravy practically counted as its own food group. In middle-class living rooms, microwaves took pride of place, even if few people actually mastered them. It wasn't just a matter of money, it was pride, appearances, and stretching each paycheck without losing warmth or dignity. Television offered only 3 channels, perhaps 4 if you were fortunate. Missing a program meant waiting days or even weeks for another showing, and the thought of streaming would have sounded like fantasy. Families sat together watching whatever was broadcast, because there were no alternatives. At night, broadcasting simply ended. The final sound before the screen went dark was "God Save the Queen." No endless feeds, no midnight content, just closure and silence. Playtime meant freedom rather than supervision. It was disorderly and rough. British Bulldog, a game so physical some schools outlawed it, ruled the playground. Disputes over football erupted with any round object children could find. Arguments were settled by chasing each other until exhaustion won. Skipping ropes, conkers, and forbidden hand clappers filled the yard. Kids returned from break with bruises, sweat, and stories, but no one fussed. That was just childhood. Shopping wasn't digital. It happened on the high street. You visited the butcher, the baker, and perhaps Woolworths for cassette singles, candy, or pencils. It was a daily ritual, personal and physical, carried home in a paper bag. Cash dominated. Debit cards were uncommon. People paid with coins, banknotes, and checks signed with name and postcode. It was slow, tangible, sometimes irritating, yet it carried a rhythm no one hurried. Before mobile phones and constant tracking, freedom looked like a cul-de-sac alive with children and no adults nearby. You stayed outside until the sky glowed orange and the street lamps blinked on. That was the universal signal to head home. Sometimes, not even then. In the quiet mornings, the milkman clinked bottles on doorsteps. It was a sound unnoticed until it vanished, the ordinary soundtrack of childhoods built without anyone realizing. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana felt like a collective fairy tale. Streets lined with flags, televisions tuned across the country. For a short time, Britain believed in something radiant and royal. Yet the decade also had grit. The Falklands conflict stirred national pride, while Live Aid pulled the globe together with music and urgency. These weren't simply headlines, they were shared experiences, replayed for days over tea in front of wooden televisions. Subtlety wasn't part of 1980s fashion. Outfits exploded with glitter, neon, and oversized designs. Shoulder pads wide enough to block a door, fluorescent leggings in every shade, jumpers deliberately 2 sizes too big. Hair reached louder extremes, teased, sprayed, sculpted into defiance of gravity. Mullets spread everywhere, while clouds of hairspray lingered like mist. Everyone looked absurd, and no one cared. The philosophy was excess. More was always better. Every street corner hosted a different tribe. Punks pierced with safety pins and snarls. Mods on scooters with polished shoes gleaming. New romantics drifting through clubs in eyeliner and lace like futuristic poets. Style transcended clothing. It was an expression of self. To adore a band meant to dress like them. Fashion and music moved hand in hand, every outfit narrating a story. The pavement became a runway of rebellion, pride, and belonging, where blending in simply didn't exist. Before consoles were sleek and quiet, video games arrived on cassette tapes that demanded endless patience. ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, you waited 10 minutes of screeches and static, only to crash and restart. The true magic thrived in arcades. Sticky floors, glowing cabinets, the buzz of worlds to conquer. Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Street Fighter, these weren't just games, they were happenings. A pound coin in your palm felt like a passport to another realm. School uniforms were anything but comfortable. Scratchy sweaters, blazers that never fit, and clip-on ties if fortune smiled. Desks were wooden, carved with decades of initials. The blackboard reigned, and the teacher ruled with chalk. Punishments carried weight. Detention meant pure silence. Lines meant hundreds. In certain schools, the cane still loomed. Teachers rarely smiled, and if they did, it usually signaled bad news. Lessons came fast. School was not for fun, it was for molding you. Margaret Thatcher's leadership divided the nation. To some she was savior, to others she shattered entire communities. The miners' strikes, protests, the shouts on nightly news, they weren't background noise, they were personal. Beyond economics, there was dread. IRA bomb threats meant bins disappeared from streets and tension hung over cities like London. It was an age of resilience and fury, marches and resistance, where no one stayed silent. Opinions were everywhere, voiced loudly. Music demanded devotion. You waited by the radio with your finger on record, hoping your chosen song would arrive. The DJ inevitably spoke over the intro or outro, but the cassette still felt priceless. Tapes were carefully labeled, Summer Mix, Top Hits for Sarah. They were emotion captured in reels, replayed, shared, or hidden under the covers for midnight listening. Public transport moved to its own beat. Red double-deckers roared, sticky and loud. The prize spot was front row, top deck, no contest. Paper tickets, freshly stamped from a chunky machine, felt like treasure. Trains rarely ran on time, swung between freezing and boiling, and smelled of cardboard cups filled with tea. Seats scratched, windows fogged, yet it always felt like a proper journey. No Wi-Fi, just scenery, a snack, and quiet before inevitably arriving late. Phones never fit in your pocket. They perched on hallway tables, cords tangled, beside notebooks of scribbled numbers. Calling meant standing still, speaking loudly, and praying another family member didn't pick up. On the streets, red phone boxes stood like landmarks. You hoped they worked, had the right change, and didn't reek inside. Calls were quick, notes unwritten, messages delivered later. Somehow, it functioned, and no one complained about being too accessible. Owning a Sony Walkman felt like invincibility. Clipped to your belt, flooding your head with sound, it cut out the world. Foam headphones disintegrated within a week, tapes inevitably got chewed, and the pencil came to the rescue, rewinding, repairing, salvaging the moment. These weren't simply tapes. They were private diaries of longing, loss, and hope set to melody. Seatbelts were loosely enforced. The air mixed cigarette smoke with cheese and onion crisps. Beneath the glove box lived a map folded until it never lay flat. Sat-navs didn't exist, only Dad's guesses and Mum's reminders of missed turns. A Ford Escort or Vauxhall Cavalier was a stroke of luck. Windows squeaked, seats stuck to bare legs in summer, radios crackled halfway through tracks, but it all felt like liberty. Summer holidays, if fortunate, meant Butlin's resorts, redcoats, talent contests, and bingo with your gran. Otherwise, it was a caravan near the coast. Rain or sunshine, you sat wrapped in towels, eating a 99 flake melting too quickly while the wind tried to steal your crisps. The beaches were cold, the sea freezing, and nobody cared. Parents hid behind windbreakers with newspapers while children chased through puddles. Sand clung everywhere, in sandwiches, socks, and memories. So, was life in 1980s Britain better? Perhaps not easier, but certainly slower, louder, and more intimate. Fewer choices existed, yet that scarcity made every moment seem richer. One television, one telephone, one Walkman. Still, we laughed more, argued more, shared more. Life wasn't scrolled, it was lived. You waited for a favorite tune. You knocked on a friend's door. You debated over dinner, music, or who got the front bus seat. And inside that disorder lived true connection. Maybe today we have convenience, but perhaps we lost a little soul in exchange. Was it truly better, or are we only polishing the good memories? Tell us what you miss most about the 80s, because those moments remain alive in all of us. Beyond the noise and the headlines, the 1980s were also defined by small rituals. Sunday dinners felt like ceremonies, with roast potatoes crisping in the oven and families squeezing around a table that was sometimes too small but always full of laughter and arguments. Those moments stitched generations together in ways that fast food and takeaway rarely achieve today. Technology was just beginning to shift. The first home computers appeared in living rooms, bulky machines with clunky keyboards and endless curiosity. Families didn't quite know what to do with them, but children explored programs, games, and code as though opening a door to another universe. Even the sound of the dial-up modem that followed later carried a promise of possibility. Sports were a national heartbeat. From muddy football fields behind schools to the roar of Wembley Stadium, games bound people together. Crowds sang in unison, scarves waving like banners of identity. Supporting a team wasn't a hobby, it was a badge of belonging, passed down like an heirloom. Victories tasted sweeter, and losses lingered longer, because everything felt magnified. Even food had its own identity. Packets of crisps with simple flavors, fizzy drinks in glass bottles returned for a few pennies, and sweets sold by weight at the corner shop. Lunchboxes carried sandwiches wrapped in foil, apples that bruised too easily, and the occasional chocolate bar that melted before the bell rang. None of it was gourmet, but it all belonged to the rhythm of the decade. And then there were the sounds of the streets. The clatter of milk bottles, the rattle of prams on uneven pavements, and the distant echo of a record player from an open window. Life unfolded in layers, shared by neighbors and overheard by strangers. Privacy was thinner, but community was thicker. You knew the people next door, sometimes too well, and that familiarity was both comforting and frustrating. Winter in the 1980s carried its own atmosphere. Frosted windows, icy winds creeping under doors, and layers of knitted scarves made by grandmothers. Central heating wasn't common everywhere, so families huddled near radiators or coal fires, sipping tea while condensation blurred the glass. Cold wasn't just weather, it was a backdrop to everyday life. School trips felt like adventures. Long coach rides with packed lunches of cheese sandwiches, crisps, and a carton of juice. Teachers tried to maintain order, but songs and laughter filled the aisles. Museums, castles, or even factories became portals of wonder, with memories less about the sights and more about the journey with friends. Even birthdays felt different. Parties at home with balloons taped to walls, musical chairs blasting from cassette players, and a homemade cake with sparklers on top. Presents were modest, sometimes practical, but the joy came from the gathering itself. The photographs, often blurred and overexposed, are now treasures of imperfect memories. Weather often dictated the pace of life. Rain was constant, seeping into shoes and soaking school uniforms. But snow, when it arrived, turned everything into magic. Streets became battlegrounds of snowball fights, gardens sprouted lopsided snowmen, and the rare school closure was celebrated like a national holiday. Cinema was another world entirely. Queues stretched outside theaters, the smell of popcorn mixed with damp coats, and tickets torn by hand. Blockbusters like E.T., Ghostbusters, and Back to the Future weren't just films. They were cultural milestones that shaped how an entire generation dreamed. Even everyday travel carried romance. Riding in the back seat of a car during long drives meant games of I Spy, watching raindrops race across windows, and dozing off to the crackle of the radio. The journey itself was the entertainment, with arguments about directions and laughter filling the gaps. Friday nights were a ritual. Families gathered around takeaway fish and chips wrapped in paper, vinegar soaking through to the table. The smell lingered for hours, a reminder of a simple indulgence that felt like a celebration at the end of the week. Radio was more than background noise. It was a companion. Pirate stations broadcast from hidden locations, sending out forbidden tracks that mainstream channels ignored. Listeners felt part of a secret club, tuning in with static-filled signals, sharing music that seemed dangerous, alive, and just for them. School discos were legendary. Gym halls transformed with colored lights and borrowed speakers. Boys stood awkwardly on one side, girls on the other, until the DJ played a slow ballad that pulled everyone onto the floor. For many, it was the first taste of romance, heartbreak, and sea hourage, all under the glow of a borrowed mirror ball. Newspapers held real weight. Headlines shouted from corner shops, pages smudged with ink on fingers, and debates started before breakfast. The Sun, the Times, the Daily Mirror, every title carried a personality, shaping opinions at kitchen tables and workplaces. News wasn't scrolled through, it was argued, passed around, and saved for clippings. Pets too were part of the landscape. Cats roamed freely, dogs accompanied children on adventures without leashes, and goldfish from fairs lived in bowls that sometimes lasted years. Animals were companions, protectors, and sometimes partners in mischief, woven naturally into daily routines. The sounds of the street stretched late into the night. The whir of bicycles, the clink of bottles in recycling crates, and the rhythm of footsteps heading home from pubs. Life spilled outside, public and open, stitched together by echoes that everyone recognized. Shopping trips into town were an event. Department stores smelled of perfume and polished wood, with escalators that felt like magic. Window displays showed entire fantasies, pulling children's noses close to the glass. Every purchase was an outing, and every outing a memory. If these memories moved you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. See you next time.